Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Pinar Yildirim. Pinar is the Associate Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School, Associate Professor at Penn Department of Economics. She is a Faculty Fellow, Senior Fellow at the Center for Technology and Innovation at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Senior Fellow at the Leonard Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a PhD in Marketing and Business Economics and a PhD in Engineering as well, both from the University of Pittsburgh. Much of her research areas focus on technology, media, and information economics. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. I really wanted to, in general, talk with somebody about just the world of marketing and how it impacts us in the 21st century. And I came across her work and her research, and it's really interesting stuff that she does. And so she was very kind to come on and talk with me about marketing and economics. And so we start the conversation by talking about what is marketing. How do we define that? It gets a lot of kind of bad reputation. And so we try to talk about what it is and what it isn't. We talk about how marketing can influence or persuade consumers. We talk about the importance of design and branding in marketing. And we talk about loyalty and why people that are marketing or even advertising, they look for loyalty in consumers. We talk about how marketing works more globally, some of the differences there, similarities. And then we switch the conversation and we talk about social media and the impact that marketing or advertisement has. We talk about content moderation, and we have this interesting discussion about whether Twitter is actually a digital public square, as some people say. We talk about public versus private-owned organizations and institutions. We talk about TikTok. We talk about data privacy, protection, and the future of marketing, and many other topics. Again, this was really a wonderful conversation. As you can hear in the conversation, obviously Pinar is very smart, very bright, and has a wonderful way of explaining many of these concepts. It doesn't feel too academic or anything, and she's absolutely wonderful in communicating the information well. I really enjoyed this conversation, mostly because it's outside of my kind of world, but really it was really interesting to see, psychology, human behavior, and the interactions it has with marketing and in a totally different world, and just kind of seeing where our paths kind of converge, if you will. And so it was such a lovely conversation with her. I greatly enjoyed it. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at my free Substack, convergingdialogues.substack.com. So get over there and subscribe and get on the list and never miss a conversation. And so now I bring you Pinar Yildirim. I am here with Pinar Yildirim. Pinar, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to it as well.
Of course. Before we get into some of the topics here, just tell listeners who you are, what your background is in terms of education, training, where you're currently at, what you currently write on and do.
Sure. I am an associate professor of marketing at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And I also have a secondary appointment at the Department of Economics of University of Pennsylvania. So I am a researcher very much situated in between these two fields. I work on topics that relate to consumers and firms, but I, of course, have a lot of questions that I think about related to economics broadly as well. I would define myself as a researcher interested in information and technology, and anything that information and technology is touching. I would put that in my broad research interest. But by background, I actually was trained as an engineer from my undergraduate, master's, and even PhD degrees. And I also got a second PhD in business economics and marketing. So by training, I would say that I am an engineer or someone who started in STEM and gradually moved into social sciences by preference.
Yeah, you are one of these really special people that has two PhDs. That's quite spectacular. How I've considered getting a second one, but I'm like, oh no, I don't. I don't know if I'm ready to do all of that. What is it that just briefly? One PhD in engineering, you said, is that right? And then the other one in economics. So what was the motivation for, obviously they're different, but what was the motivation for getting two PhDs?
It was all a coincidence, actually. I did not set out to be an academic, but once you start, I think, learning and research, you realize how much fun it is and how there are no boundaries for learning. So I think I happened to come across the right people and the right questions at the right time that opened up the door to be able to expand my studies into social sciences. And social sciences, in many ways, I think there are many different, of course, disciplines under social sciences. But thinking about business and economics, in some ways, perhaps these fields are underrated. They are. We seem to think that they are perhaps easier, less technical, less complicated, and that's the wrong perception. These fields are immensely more complicated just because of the human factor. We have to put humans in the center of these disciplines and think about all the things that they have to take into account when they're making decisions. And that makes any system or any question, I think, infinitely more difficult to think about, more complex, more complicated. And that's really what attracted me eventually to social sciences, just putting the human element and studying things that really matter for people.
I like the way you put that. Well, maybe at some point you'll get a third in social psychology or.
Well, our life is all about learning and research. That's right. So why not?
That's right. Yeah. So I like the way you phrase that, and even more so, we understand that there's a push or an encouragement of having a kind of multidisciplinary type of way of understanding problems in the world, and so it's not more of here's the economics, folks over here and the, psychology folks over here and philosophy. There's a trying to blend and overlap and have everyone at the table kind of, looking at each other's notes, if you will, and trying to see, okay, we have this issue or these problems or these ways of approaching things. And how do we all kind of say our piece? So it seems in many ways, things are moving towards that way, which historically wasn't always that way. So I think that's a good thing. So,
I very much agree with that view. I think it's wonderful when we can bring in different fields, different perspectives, and look at things maybe from a different angle. We might be able to uncover things that maybe researchers before us have not been able to uncover, or make these combinations. Have these combinations of fields that will generate a subfield, and that's very much, I think, things are going both in social sciences as well as sciences and engineering. We like different perspectives. We try to bring in different angles. And even though you put it, my background as somewhat of a unique thing, and thank you for doing that, I should say in my department, marketing at Wharton, I think we're about 26 faculty members now, and I am one of the three who has two PhDs. So it's not very uncommon, actually, to, I think, study multiple different disciplines and then go into a different field and carry out research.
Yeah, well, that's very. I like what you say about maybe creating subdisciplines and things like that, or categories of study, and I think we do need more folks doing that type of work, kind of across different fields. So let me just ask generally, how do we usually define marketing? What are the kind of boundaries or limits of marketing? And then how does that interact with some of the things we've been saying about with economics or engineering or social psychology or other disciplines? How do we kind of understand it now in the 21st century?
Well, Xavier, I think marketing always gets the bad rep in some ways.
Yes.
We tend to think of it as these manipulative actions of firms, or at least just putting it or thinking about it from the practice perspective. We tend to think of it as these activities, processes, the communications, and delivery and design of products, the firm actions that relate to all of these activities. But just like any other field, when you look into the academic practice of marketing, I think you will see that there's a much wider gap, and the scope of the questions that we study, we think about in academia and marketing, it's widely vaster. It's a lot bigger than the questions that I think practice or the managers are focusing on in industry. So if you ask me how I define marketing in academia, I think that we as researchers are looking at anything and everything that firms are doing that might impact consumers, that might impact organizations, other organizations, competitors, as well as the governmental organizations, public society. But we are also thinking a lot about the individual decision making, anything that relates to consumption of goods, services, and consumption of anything that can come to mind. I mean, by consumption, I might, I would be referring to the food that you pick up from the shelf. I might refer to the car that you drive, or I might be referring to just the content that you consume online, or your consumption of time. Any factor that contributes to the decision making relating to consumption would be something that we as marketing academia would be interested in. What makes consumers, what makes individuals decide to consume some goods more than others? Why are you picking up one particular brand or one particular product category more than others? Some factors relate to very much things about you, your personal preferences. I might like the taste of a product. I might like the look of a brand. I might like the packaging. I might like maybe the convenience of buying that particular product. And, there might be more complicated factors. Maybe I like the car that I'm driving because it's communicating something about me. I like a brand because it signals something to myself about my personal identity and values. So many things might relate to ourselves or our nature, the decisions that we make about consumption. But of course, there are many factors or many strategies that firms, brands might be following that also influence our consumption decision. The advertisements that they put out, the brand image that they create, the promotions and pricing strategies that they follow. Of course, these would be very much influencing our decision to buy a product. So as an outcome, is naturally, all of these strategies are also of interest to us as marketing researchers in academia.
Yeah, there's a lot of jumping off points there. So let me ask one thing here about this. You said about the individual. For us as in terms of marketing, we marketing is trying to look at various consumers, and we can consume, as you said, so many things. We can consume information, we can consume food, we can consume just about anything, right? We're very good consumers of things, right? Or maybe not
Yes.
always a good thing. Maybe it's too much, right? But that's a different question. But I guess the question here is how do we understand? I guess marketing. There's this idea between the individual, right? You have an audience in mind. So if it's you could go in any domain here, but how do we, there's so many different types of individuals with different motivations, with different things that they're looking for or not. And then how that scales, where we're now talking about groups of individuals and how certain, folks in a demographic or whichever variable you want to look at, how do we understand how marketing kind of zooms in and zooms out, I guess, between individuals and then individuals within a group and a certain population they might, fall into?
Absolutely. And this is what makes marketing immensely complicated. This, again, relates back to that human element. It's
Yes.
not just about the the demographic characteristics, your location, your age, your gender, other things that might potentially impact your consumption. But it's also about those hard to observe factors, your psychology, your personality, and so on. So in fact, this is very much the practice of marketing. When marketing managers think about whom to sell a product or what kind of an ad to put out and whom to show those ads, they have to think precisely about these factors. And they have to carry out surveys, they have to carry out conversations with consumers to understand who the product is for and what exactly is it that they appreciate about the product. And as a result of that, for instance, for a given product, you might see 5 different ads highlighting 5 different factors and served over 5 different TV channels or 5 different newspaper ads that very much highlight different aspects that are only going to speak to that audience. That's the idea of targeting in marketing. We like to highlight specific aspects that is going to be relating to the audience who might be appreciating those factors and carry out many studies. Again, this is practice, not so much the academia, but carry out many surveys and studies that will try to identify exactly which type of consumer. And you might be looking into demographics. Again, you might be looking into lifestyles, the inspirations of consumers, aspirations, and so on. You might be looking into many factors, very complicated factors, to be able to identify who the product is for, how exactly to communicate the attributes and the qualities of the product to that person, through exactly which channels. And if you want to sell through different promotions, I mean, for some consumers, for instance, the price-sensitive consumer, price promotions will be more attractive. For others, maybe it's the brand image. Identifying exactly what aspects will help them to make the decision, perhaps to adopt that product, to try that product. But that underlying heterogeneity, it's much wider for some consumers and some products. What I mean by that is that, for instance, you might have a yogurt, right? With yogurt, there might be 20 different flavors, and for hard to predict reasons, people will have a favorite of a very different flavor. And there might be other products where maybe that heterogeneity is much less. Some of the technological products, everybody might want the best thing that they can afford. So there might be much less heterogeneity in what people are looking for and what kind of features they appreciate. But that is very much, very much something that is in the center of marketing. We need to think about what different consumers want and what kind of products we can serve them. And as a result, we will have to think about many different questions regarding how exactly to communicate all the characteristics of these products and how to market them. Mm-hmm. But again, that's more the practice. I think in academia, we don't always think about these practical questions. We might be thinking about, for example, how exactly to elicit those preferences. We might think about how to understand the preferences of different users, and then thinking about how to come up with an efficient plan to maybe narrow down, create these segments of users, because you might have 100 different types of preferences, but you cannot always serve 100 different products. You might need to create categories of people. So we think about how best to elicit, perhaps, or how to create tools that might help us to elicit those preferences in the best ways, so that we capture the best preferences in the best way, and we don't leave out any consumers, or at least try to serve them something that's close to their preferences as well.
Well, again, there's 2 major things here that I want to touch on. So one of them is I want to come to design and branding. I think there's some of this stuff that's obviously connected with types of marketing and how to understand what people are consuming or not. Before that, though, I want to ask about this is more of an ethical or a philosophical question. So just as a footnote here, even within this conversation that we're having, people can hear all the different disciplines that we're kind of touching on, right? We're talking about individual psychology, social psychology, design. We're talking about philosophy, ethics. All of these people can maybe see how it's very interesting how there's a lot of which you could say cross-pollination of sorts that's going on here with many of these issues when you have the human at the center here. But my main question is on this point that you're making is, in terms of marketing and the ways that you've been describing it, my question is about influence and manipulation, right? And so how much do we, this might be, I'm trying to figure out which is the chicken or the egg here, right? Which is, I don't think it's a bidirectional way of traveling down this road, but how much of a consumer's interests, motivations, desires, etc., are motivating various marketing, companies or brands, or the reverse? How much of it is, look, in a capitalist society, the idea is, at least in the United States, is, okay, we want you to buy our stuff, or we want you to listen to our stuff, or watch our stuff, or get information from us. And so we're going to do these various marketing campaigns or advertisements or whatever it is. So that way, now you think you need to read this or see this or, buy this or whatever. And if people don't, and I guess how much are the ethics involved here of, that could be manipulative in some ways, where we're telling people this is the best thing to get and it has to be this when really it's not. And it's just ways in which people think they need the best thing. Some people could say, well, if you're a good capitalist company, that's great because you're going to make more money and as much as you can do and go for it. But how do we understand, I guess, this idea of companies influencing or marketing companies influencing consumers, or consumers influencing what marketing companies do? And again, maybe that's a chicken or the egg thing, but how do we think about that problem or question about, maybe an unhealthy manipulation or some type of, poor influence? How do we think of it in that way?
It's a great question. And it's a question that, of course, in academia, we tend to think a lot more about. It's empirically speaking, it's a little hard to answer this question because, when we carry out actions, for instance, when we expose consumers to advertisements that might give information to those consumers, we don't know if the consumer eventually purchased the product when they had absolutely no intention of purchasing it, or if they realized from being exposed to the information about the product that they got something and they realized, oh, I really could use this product. I really could have a need for a product like this, and eventually decided to purchase it. Mm. But ultimately, from the perspective of marketers or I think academics in marketing, we believe that consumers should be informed about products and services. And for any firm, what's in the best interest is that I would like to understand a consumer really well, and then eventually serve them a product that they will really love. They are going to like, they are going to benefit from using that product. Their lives will be improved, hopefully, by using that product. And if I can really find that product for them and serve that product to them, they will have a greater willingness to pay, and they are going to perhaps come back to me with the next product. So understanding the needs of the consumer and serving the right product with the right features is really important from the perspective of at least marketing academics as well as the marketing practitioners. I think that's how we tend to think about it. And that's also how we tend to think about some of the marketing actions. We think that, or at least this is the economic thought behind advertising, advertising can be very informative when consumers can see various different brands and can learn, okay, these are the important features of this particular car. This car has a better performance, perhaps, or this car has more capacity in trunk or more seats. I can understand without having to go and search myself, perhaps making that trip to the store, to a car dealer. I can understand some of the characteristics of the product. And hopefully that should help me make better decisions about myself, my needs, the product that I'm going to purchase. So I think, again, just summing this up, our view is that marketing efforts should be carried out in a way that helps the consumers to make better decisions for themselves and that helps them to to buy things that satisfy their needs. And then on top of that, of course, if we can put some policies in there, either with the help of consumer protection agencies or through the willingness of the firms, because they have also an interest in making sure that consumers are happy with them. There's no point selling them a junk product or a product that they don't want, because, ultimately in the long term, if they are going to hate that product, they're not going to come back to you. And maybe they will create negative word of mouth. They will talk to others and say how they decided to buy this product and they never really got any benefit out of it. They really don't need it. And that's ultimately not good for your firm. So in the long term, or thinking about the post-purchase process, which is something that, of course, firms have to do as well as academics, if you're not happy with the product, that's not a good thing. So there are, as a result of that, of course, there are return policies. We want you to not hate the brand after you buy something that you discover maybe you don't need. Maybe if you were in the spur of the moment, you saw an ad, you thought that you needed something, and it turned out not to meet exactly your needs or your expectations. We want you in general to be not stuck with that. I mean, this speaking from an academic perspective or a public policy perspective or from a managerial perspective. And that's why we have these policies in place. Now, that being said, of course, this is maybe a very rosy view of how I think we tend to define marketing. Would there be ads that would potentially influence people to buy a product that they think they need, or maybe create the feeling of a need? I think it's possible that indeed some of the image that's put out there or the frequent reminders, they might also, at least on the margin, influence some purchase behavior. And if the consumer is unable to return the product in a timely manner, if the consumer is not given the protections, post-purchase protections, there might be occasions, I think, where consumption is motivated, because we know advertising works. At least there's a lot of heterogeneity in how advertising works too, as a side note. But advertising can push people to be able to buy products, even if it's at the small rates. Yes. So marketing efforts can be manipulated.
I guess you're saying about this in terms of marketing from an academic perspective, but I'm sure you'll, admit that there are definitely major companies that will not do this in a positive way. Certainly, yes. They will try to influence people of, you need this, and if you don't have it, then you don't have as much status, or you're missing out, or it's outdated, or that's certainly, because at the end of the day, companies want to make as much money. I'm maybe this is just me, and this could be my ignorance, but isn't many capitalist companies, the major goal is not the consumer necessarily. It's more of, how do we make money? How do we make capital?
Absolutely. No, companies are profit-making companies, but at the same time, any company with a good management and a long-term view should understand that selling one product to a consumer is not the end of it. You would like to be able to have repeated relationships, successful, repeated, loyal relationships with a customer, where you want the consumer to be able to come back to you and be happy with their purchase after you sell the first product to them. This is true for car companies, which they tend to sell fairly few number of products to a given consumer, but this is absolutely true for a car company, because there's a lot of correlation between what kind of car you buy. If you are likely to buy one car, you might upgrade a couple of years later to a different car within the same brand. This is true for detergent companies. This is true for yogurt companies. We want the consumer to be happy with their purchase so that they can come back and continue to buy. So this, I think, one-time opportunistic sale idea, that might be perhaps a speculative idea, thinking that that's what the companies are interested in. We'll just sell you one thing and then run off, and then we'll never see you again. That's not a very realistic view of the world, especially, if you think about the fast-moving consumer goods, where there's a high frequency of purchase. You have to repeatedly engage with the consumer. You have to keep them happy. subscription products where people continue to pay on a regular basis. So I think for a great majority of the firms, again, I'm thinking about firms that really have a long-term vision, and some proper management, as opposed to a firm that's just out there thinking that they will go make quick amount of money and run out of business, and no one will ever see them again. I think for the majority of the brands, we, not just academics, but the managers also have this view that consumers should be happy with their purchase ultimately. So this idea of manipulating, tricking them into buying something that they will hate later and they will regret that purchase is not a good way of doing marketing or being a manager. And I don't think this is the view that represents most marketers.
Okay, that's good. It's good to hear. It's good to know. Let me use maybe two popular examples. And if you don't want to, say anything about it publicly, that's fine. But the two that come to mind, and which will, people will know about kind of globally, is I think of Apple and I think of Amazon. These are obviously massive companies that have global reach, et cetera. And I think about it in this way, where I wonder in terms of people's motivations, right? When they need something, right? They can take a pragmatic view, right? Or they can take, maybe that plus some, wants, but they throw it in there. So for example, you were talking about cars. Personally, I'm a pragmatic kind of person, generally, right? So I need a car that gets me from point A to point B, isn't going to break down, isn't too terrible for the environment, isn't too bad for gas, or if it's a hybrid or whatever. And so I want it to be comfortable, and I don't need to have the most expensive car or whatever, but and it has to be okay for me to pay the lease or the car note or whatever. That's a pragmatic kind of decision I'm making, right? And of course, there's many options and many cars out there, but my decision making on that, some of the marketing or the advertisements that may be used will be, maybe focused on folks like myself, right? That are very kind of pragmatic, and yes, that's our brand and that's what we do. Other folks, if you're, buying an Audi or, a BMW or Mercedes, it's like, well, you want luxury, right? You want something that is reliable, right? If you think of a German-made car, let's say, it's usually seen as reliable. And there's a history there with that, but then also luxurious. Okay, so you're kind of selling to a certain kind of person or a group of people. But in terms of like with Apple and Amazon, so like for example, right, before Amazon had Prime, right, and everything was shipped at whatever rate it was, I think at least in the United States, I don't know how it is globally, but I mean, I'm so used to getting things in 2 days now. Like if I'm going to buy something and it takes 5 days, I'm kind of annoyed, right? Especially if it's something small and like insignificant or something, right? And I've been conditioned of this way of like, well, I can get it on Amazon Prime cheaper, and it can usually from other places, and it usually gets there in 2 days. Sometimes it can get there shorter. And like I've bought into this, right? And it's, would I be fine without it? Of course I would. It's not a big deal. But and to me, isn't that something where it's like it's a good kind of business model? The way they market it, the way that they advertise this is, all of these things. It's the convenience and all these things. And the same with Apple, right? Everybody is every year they have a new phone, right? It's a new model, right? And now they have this whole plan now where it's like you basically lease your phone, right? Because you're going to get a new one in 2 years max anyways. So you're always kind of what you were saying. You're always coming back. If you like the product, it's practical, it's, in vogue or whatever, and everyone has one and things like that. You want to keep coming back, especially if it's something that needs to keep being updated. So in those kind of examples, are these kind of examples of what you're saying of like, it's advantageous for a company to brand or market or advertise something where people like the product enough that they have buy-in to it. Like they keep coming back to it. They keep wanting to do it. Are those like, those are two big examples, but is that kind of what you mean in that way? Or there may be downsides of that where you're getting people too conditioned and they're not looking at other options. It's always just one or two, and it should be more than that.
Well, I think you're touching a number of very different areas and interesting discussions here. So the first thing you mentioned, for instance, the difference in the consumer preferences regarding what kind of a product they would like to have with cars. And that goes back to our earlier discussion. People have different needs and different preferences and different priorities that they are looking for when they are consuming products. For some consumers, it might be that I need a car that takes me from A to B and I don't care about any other features. For other individuals, it might be that I need a product that also communicates something about me. And that's very much the idea of the conspicuous goods or luxury products that consumers want to consume. In some subset of individuals are not only interested in the features of the product, the utilitarian features of the product, the functionality of the product, or how how it maintains these basic needs that serves the basic needs of the consumer. But they are interested in something else. They're interested in, for instance, that the brand that they are buying might be communicating something about themselves, and this could be their values. Like you might be buying a very environmental friendly product because it communicates something about your values. Mm-hmm. You might be buying a luxury product because it communicates something about your wealth, and that's something you want to signal to others. Maybe that correlates with many other things: your social status, your education, your the family background, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not here to judge what consumers want or what they prefer, what they should prefer. I, as a researcher, that's not something I can say this is good or bad. But we know that there are many consumers out there looking for products that might carry additional features that communicate qualities about themselves.
Yeah. So essentially what you're saying is that, like, if I see Pinar has a Prius, I'm like, oh, she cares about the planet. That's nice. Yeah. She's very environmental friendly. She's going to take a hit to driving a car that looks absolutely terrible aesthetically. But you know what? That's nice. But if you show up to a meeting and you roll out of your Audi A8, it's going to be like, wow. I mean, how much is she making a year? That's a very nice car. Look at that. You're saying that in at least with cars, whether we like it or not, these things do have some type of signaling of what your status is or what your values or priorities are. Yeah?
They really are. They do. And this is not only true for cars. Think about the clothing, right? Your choice of clothing, your apparel decisions, your branding decisions, shoes, clothes, even your makeup, putting it on or off. Many products communicate things about us. And again, I'm not, as a researcher, I have no judgment about whether this is good or bad, but I'm just simply saying this is what the consumers are interested in, being able to communicate certain things through their consumption decisions or no consumption decisions. And when that exists, firms serve these needs, and they produce products that might be aligned with the needs of the consumers, whether that means putting a Prius out there that is going to be environmental friendly. And that's one of the reasons why when you look at these environmental friendly cars, they tend to have very similar design choices. If you look at a Honda, Toyota, you will see that cars tend to have very similar design aesthetics or features. They look very similar to each other. And that's for a strategic reason, that it's very easy to recognize that car as a hybrid or as an electric car. And, because those consumers are also interested in signaling their environmental friendly features or values. So the same thing. I mean, this is a thought that goes back to late 19th century. Thorsten Veblen has written a book about the theory of leisure class. And in that book, he talked a lot about how the riches use various consumption tools in order to signal qualities about themselves, and how they can excessively consume sometimes, or burn money to be able to signal their status, their wealth, their place in society. Again, I cannot judge this, but given that consumers or individuals have these tendencies, what firms are doing are simply providing products that facilitate those preferences.
So I guess the one quick thing here. Well, let me ask about the branding piece of this before I ask about the kind of global piece of it. So how much is I mean, we've been kind of touching up around it, but I guess directly here. How much is branding and design, whether that's digital media design or graphic design properly, or type of branding that's done for these companies, in terms, what is the kind of relationship between design, branding, and marketing, right? And how much of that, what's the crossover there, and how do you understand it? I guess from an academic perspective of, what is the importance or significance or value of using branding or digital types of design and things like that? Like, what is the significance or importance of that currently in our digital age, and how that works with marketing?
Very important. So design is an aspect that separates your product from the existing products in the marketplace. And it might also signal again or communicate some of the values that you have. You might care a lot about, for instance, art or artistic design or minimal features, minimal aesthetic. And you may want to communicate that through your consumption choices. So I think design, of course, is always carried out first and foremost to be able to provide a product that meets consumer needs in terms of consumption. Then you have a font design, the size of that product, maybe the screen size and the features are all parts of the design, and they are carried out in a way that makes it easy and convenient to use that product. And of course makes it hopefully long-term and durable. But at the same time, the aesthetic features will first of all separate the product from the other existing competitors in the marketplace, create some differentiation for the product. And on top of that, it might communicate some, again, preferences that you might have in terms of your aesthetic valuations to others. So it might also help you to communicate things. Again, this is maybe more evident if you look at apparel choices. Your fashion choice might communicate some things about you and your personality. Maybe if you have always colorful clothes, maybe you are a more fun person, and that is easier to communicate. If you're a very serious person, perhaps you always have these, maybe you're always walking around in suits, and maybe that communicates something about you and your character and your personality and so on. So aesthetic, I think, is a big part of what design is in general, a big part of also communicating consumer characteristics. But sorry.
Yeah, well, I was going to say in terms of the fashion sense, I do think fashion does. You could use this maybe with hair and makeup as well. It is almost a type of projective of sorts of one's personality. I mean, again, I'm not going to heavily weight that because you wore jeans and a blazer as opposed to a full 3-piece suit says something entirely about who you are as a person. But I think it does say something about interest or affinities. There's at least that's a something to be considered. I don't think it obviously isn't going to tell everything about a person, but for me, I mostly wear gray and black and blue, very monochromatic, because I'm kind of boring and in those ways. You're never going to see me with like polka dots and orange and pink and purple. I'm not loud in that way in terms of my fashion. I trend very conservative in how I conservative small c in terms of how I dress. But again, there is something there. Like if somebody knows enough about me, they know that, I'm not an extreme person. I'm usually not very, actually loud in a room. I can be subdued and quiet and observant and cerebral sometimes. And so that kind of makes sense, right? And again, this isn't like a one-to-one kind of thing, but so I definitely agree with you there. And I guess one question here about the branding thing. So you mentioned yogurt. So, well, I'll tell you about this. So I think yogurt's absolutely disgusting, right? I know it's really good for you. I know it's, really, really healthy for you and stuff. I can't, I'm a texture guy. I can't, I don't like the textures. It's just, I know it's really good for you though. But like, okay, so I don't know anything about yogurt, right? I don't eat yogurt. But I know is when you said whenever earlier in the conversation, yogurt, the first thing I thought of was, the last time I was at the store, the Chobani brand. Like I see it, I have the visual in my head. Again, I don't eat yogurt. I don't buy yogurt, but that branding is so good that when I think of yogurt, I associate yogurt with that brand. Right. I don't know if it's the typeface they're using, the amount of kerning in between the letters, the color scheme, the presentation and orientation for it, or all of it. But I said, or maybe there's just more of that one than other ones. I'd have to look up right now other types of brands of yogurt. Right. So I guess in that way, when people have, like, if you go, like, groceries are kind of easy with this. If you go to like a grocery store, and this might be a little bit different in other countries, but I'll just say here in the US, like if I go, with yogurt, let's say, but let's say I go down the aisle and I need to buy toothpaste, right? It's something everybody needs. Everyone needs toothpaste. I mean, holy shit, there's like, 18 different types of fucking toothpaste, right? And it's like, well, how do you choose? How do you choose which one? And I promise you, because I do this, and I know a lot of other people do it, I just choose the one that looks the most appealing to me. Right? It's like, it's all the same. I don't really care. This looks nice. Done. Right? I don't really buy into the whole, like, this one makes your teeth more whiter, or this one cleans them better. I think they're all kind of the same, more or less. And so it's like, okay, if I have too many options, I'm just going to pick the one that looks nice, whether it's the box or the type of tube it's in or whatever, right? In terms of decision making is what I'm getting at here. So my point is here, how does the branding or design elements impact decisions that consumers make, and how that connects with what marketing is doing or not doing with that?
Absolutely. So let me first say that branding goes beyond packaging or advertising. Sure. I think some of the elements that you were referring to were maybe more the influence of advertising. You might be seeing, for instance, Chobani ads, and over time, you hearing the name or seeing the logos over and over again, and of course, seeing the product in the store might help you to remember this brand as something that's on top of your mind. And that's a very deliberate effort. I'll tell you in a second why, but branding in general goes beyond the efforts of advertising or putting the product high on the shelf in a grocery store. It is the idea of creating a name that communicates information about the product, as well as oftentimes trust, so that you would be willing to pay, hopefully as a consumer, a higher price for that particular product, because you know that there are advantages that come with that particular product compared to another brand. So it is a way of creating differentiation in the mind of the consumer, but also communicating various characteristics about the product, helping the consumers understand those characteristics, and also building trust. People might be buying, for instance, a Mercedes, let me put it an example, because they think that the car is going to be reliable. They know, without even seeing maybe the product itself, just that brand name is going to communicate or going to promise the consumer a higher level of engineering quality. So those promises, or the product, the higher quality that you are promising to the consumer, is oftentimes correlated with the idea of branding. So branding is in some way a reputation building that will help the consumer to prefer that product, to differentiate that product in the marketplace compared to others. And it's not just about the advertisements you put out there, but it's also very much related to the experience that the consumer has. If you have the product, you're buying it, you're consuming it, a very important piece of a product's success in the marketplace is the word of mouth. If you talk to your friends and your family and talk to them about this product, then that has an enormous effect on their choice. That word of mouth piece is very important. But ultimately, to be able to create a brand name, you have to do a lot of these efforts of advertising, maybe putting the product in front of the consumer, helping the consumer, first of all, be aware of the product, and also maybe help the consumer to have the product as top of their mind. But it goes a lot beyond these efforts. It also has to buy in the consumer's trust. for a successful brand. And of course, that being said, advertising is a very important piece of this. Advertising helps to make consumers aware of a product, hear the name, become aware of what that product is supposed to look like, what are some of the characteristics of the product, it's healthy, it's good for you, or other claims that a brand might put into an ad. And on top of that, for especially fast-moving consumer goods like yogurt, right? This is a cheap product that you buy fairly frequently. So at any time you're making a decision, it's almost an automated purchase, or it is a low engagement decision. For most people, when you go into a grocery store, you might have a long list of items to buy. And you don't want to spend 5 minutes in front of the yogurt aisle trying to decide which product to buy, right? That's not a very efficient way of shopping.
Right. So
most people, exactly, for that reason, most people will just use heuristics. They're not necessarily going to optimize, buying the decision of buying yogurt. They're not going to say, which one is the best yogurt? Let me compare all the options, figure out all the health benefits, read the labels and compare prices. They're not going to do that. But they are going to use exactly heuristics like the one that you described. You said, well, I look at the package that looks the most appealing. And I don't know how you personally define appealing. Appealing might be maybe a colorful, nice package, but that's going to vary from one person to another dramatically. Right. For someone else, it might be, for a lot of consumers, especially fast-moving consumers good, it's the price. They would they'll scan the prices and buy the thing that's the cheapest. That's a very good very commonly used heuristic. And for others, it might be indeed, well, there are 5 brands here, but I've only heard one of them. The advertising might help you to say, okay, I've heard about this brand, so I'll give this one a try, or I will buy this. But oftentimes, it is also your satisfaction with the brand or familiarity, as in you've consumed the product in the past. This is especially true for detergents. I sometimes in my MBA class, just for fun, I ask the students, okay, so what's your favorite detergent brand? And no one will come up with a favorite, right? This is not a product that we feel very excited about, but it's almost an automated purchase. Was the product doing its job sufficiently? Yes. If it is, then I'll continue to buy the same thing because I create a habit of buying that product over time. And advertising can come in and become helpful to consumers to initiate the purchase, the first purchase, or maybe initiate the ability to switch to a different product. So in the fast-moving consumers, good category, detergents, food items, you see a lot of frequent advertising as a result of that. But of course, advertising can do other things. It can build the idea of a product that you might want once you grow up, right? For instance, if you look into car ads, those ads are not there to make you run to the dealer and buy a product, but they are there to create the impression of a product for a long-term purchase or create an ideal over time. Maybe, once you get that big promotion, that's when you go and buy that particular product. So you look into a lot of the high-end luxury car advertisements, you will see that they're not necessarily putting in the engineering features out there as information, but it's the persona that drives that car that's almost in the center of the ad. It's creating an aspiration for the consumer for the long-term consumption. So it's a slightly different type of impression building. It's a brand building effort, but it's not something that is done like as in the fast-moving consumer goods where you highlight, it's this product is really good for you. It's really healthy. Only, 0 grams of sugar, 12 grams of protein. So those highlight very quick benefits to you that you might consider in purchase or the price and so on. But other ads won't be like that. But I want to get into sort of a related concept here, if we have the time. This is the idea of loyalty, right? I mean, if you think about it, brands really want consumers to be loyal. If I want you to buy the product, I want you to love the product. But from the perspective of at least academics, when you look into loyalty, what does it mean for a consumer to be loyal? There are various different types of loyalty. And in this particular example that we were talking about, this idea of the consumer going and buying the same detergent every single time, even though they have no idea about the product characteristics, perhaps really above and beyond the fact that it does the job. And even though they don't really love I'm going to mention a brand, but they're not in love with Tide as a brand. They will go and buy the same product. And that's the process of inertia. You are not interested in spending 5 minutes in front of the detergent aisle trying to pick the best product. You're not interested in reading. It's a fairly low engagement product. You are not going to dramatically regret it if you end up buying the product that's next to best. It's a fairly frequent purchase, and the price tag is oftentimes not that high. So in those cases, consumers will show maybe loyalty, but it's going to be driven by inertia. In other cases, you might have loyalty, and that's sometimes when we think about loyalty, that's the first thing that comes to mind. That's the idea of a consumer being infatuated with a brand. Like there are these brands that we tend to love. They provide great products, or they really help us to express something about ourselves. I can ask you if you have a favorite product. I'm sure many consumers tend to have these favorites. Sometimes with the younger populations, when I ask them, I'll get names, I'll get brands like Apple, or they will talk about Spotify, or they will talk about Nike. That is brands that put in a lot of effort in creating an image, and they almost appeal to a certain maybe part of the population. But at the same time, consumers really are able to find some elements that they love, and they create this really emotional bond. Now, creating that emotional bond doesn't always translate into a purchase. You might, for instance, love Chanel, but you might not have the money to be able to buy Chanel, but you might nevertheless be very interested in consuming things. So sometimes the idea of loyalty is basically confused by this notion of love, but that doesn't always translate into a purchase. So just wanted to put it out there. Sometimes you put these advertisements out, but it doesn't always imply that the brand is going to be, at least in the short term, going to be able to monetize that or end up selling a consumer something. They might be interested in creating impressions, aspirations, perhaps for the long term, but they might not always financially benefit from it.
Yeah, that's a really nice point there. So I wonder how much of that is in terms of the loyalty piece, or how much they have attachment sounds too serious, but for
attachment.
For lack of a better word, an attachment. I mean, yes, I think for a lot of people, it is a very pragmatic kind of decision. It's an economic decision, as you were saying. I love this brand, but I don't have the money to buy this right now, or maybe it's a long-term thing. But I think that's obviously something that people do care about for certain things, and maybe not for other things. So if you ask me, sometimes I'll have these fun discussions with people, and you say, "Are you a Nike guy? Or are you an Adidas guy?" Or and when anytime I've had these fun discussions, I'll say, "You could absolutely put me head to toe in anything Puma. Puma is my thing. I love Puma. I have so many Puma shoes. I have sweatshirts. I have, I love Puma. And if you ask me why, I can't give you a good reason why. I mean, their quality is very good. It's a very, very good quality, but I like the kind of we were saying, the brands, the style, the fits. I like the way in which they make their shoes or their clothes. But if you ask me about Under Armour, Under Armour is great, and I think it's good for some things, but I don't have an allegiance to it. But I know people that do. They'll wear everything head to toe in Under Armour. Same thing with Nike, whatever. And they have this this loyalty or allegiance. And I think you're right. I think that's more in the world of an affinity, right? There could be other internal reasons for people having loyalty to a brand. It's always worked for them. It's not too expensive. It's good quality. It looks nice, feels nice, whatever. The makeup thing is interesting, though. I mean, again, I don't wear makeup, obviously, but I wonder, some of that can be, in some ways, again, I'm ignorant on this stuff, but in terms of skin products, and I think it depends on the person wearing makeup. And in some ways, certain types of makeup are better for certain types of skin, in terms of some people have an allergic reaction to certain types of makeup and not other people. It's about skin tones, and one brand, I can't give you all the details of what's the difference between MAC or Bobbi Brown or, Mary Kay makeup, right? There are differences, right? Of course. But sometimes when people make these choices, I think maybe could be that the loyalty is, this works for me. And it was really hard to find something that works for me for a while because of, in terms of skin, again, like I said, in terms of allergic reactions, or finding the right kind of makeup that matches skin tone, or whatever. Well, there could be a bunch of reasons. So maybe, I guess the question here is, even with the loyalty piece that you're bringing up, which is super important, I would suspect that the reasons for the loyalty could obviously have a lot of variance. Would you agree here?
Absolutely. And we only mentioned two. I mean, there could be other reasons. Sometimes consumers will be loyal to a brand, at least looking at their revealed their actions, their revealed preferences. You might see a consumer flying the same airline over and over again, and not because they like the airline, or not because they are infatuated or attached to the brand, but because they simply want to rack up the loyalty points. And that's a different kind of loyalty, that you simply are using the same product over and over again because they provide something to you in return. So that could be different ways of loyalty. And it's hopefully the consumer is smart enough to be able to make decisions that work for them. So if they like a brand a lot, if they like what the brand is saying for them or doing for them, and if they have the time to be able to search for the information about the products, hopefully they will be able to find something that works for them. And hopefully the brand is doing something, like, again, communicating the features of the product that help consumers to reduce that search time. And can that loyalty sometimes result in a consumer to buy something that they don't need, or buy something paying a higher price than maybe a very comparable product? Absolutely. I think that might very well be the case. But hopefully the consumers can make decisions for themselves. I mean, the one thing, of course, we can say, well, what's the alternative, right? What can we do? Can we take a paternalistic view and say, nope, firms should not advertise, firms should not reach out to consumers, they should not try to communicate any product information, and maybe we should stop consumers from making purchases that are big items. But can we really take that paternalistic view? I think that's the other question. What's the alternative? If you think that there are mistakes that consumers can make. Now, consumer protection agencies and firms hopefully realize that a mistake that a consumer can make should be reversible and provide return policies that are generous enough, or hopefully, before making a big decision, inform them in the right ways so that consumers can make the right decisions for themselves. So there has to be some policies that are potential remedies. But I think at the end of the day, we also have to ask the question, can we interfere with the consumer decision-making process, or should we?
Well, I think on that bit of it, I want to ask you about that in terms of media. So I'll come back to that. But I guess the one last thing here about many of the things we've been talking about before we switch to that is, I mean, we're both here in the U.S. at the moment, but I'm wondering how, and I don't know if you know this or not, or so again, as much as you want to speak on it, but how does marketing look globally, right? So obviously the U.S., it's a major country. Obviously China's a major country, India, et cetera. But in terms of marketing in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, all these different parts of the world, obviously there's going to be differences, country to country or whatever, based on consumers, and depends on the product, et cetera. But I guess in general, whether it's a global kind of product, so I mentioned Apple, or you can Google or things like that, or maybe other types of products that Coca-Cola, I guess, or I don't know, something that has a global reach. I guess what is there any is there like a common denominator across different countries and cultures and continents in terms of marketing and how it works? Because if the premise is, or if the emphasis is, well, if we place the human at the center of marketing, right, and how we understand those things, well, humans are different around the world, but at the same time, there are things that make us all human, right? And there is some constancy, I would say, there. Whatever that is or isn't is, debatable. But so how much do we see, marketing kind of globally or internationally, in terms of similarity and maybe difference?
So there are similarities as well as differences. If you think of global brands, I can think of McDonald's, for instance.
Sure.
McDonald's will have, of course, some of their offerings that you can find in the United States, anywhere else in the world. But at the same time, as they go into local markets, they will start shifting their menus a little bit closer to the local flavors and to include some items that are closer to the local cuisine. So they will definitely shift some elements to make the product offering and service closer to the needs of the local customers. But I think that as well as advertising, right? If you have consumers who appreciate different aspects of the product, maybe it's pricing, maybe it's cleanliness, maybe it's the fact that, you go to McDonald's and you get maybe small items and you get a kids menu. Maybe consumers appreciate different aspects around the world, and you might highlight those throughout the campaigns that you have in different countries. But I think the one aspect that will be common is that you want to be, if you're a global brand or if you want to be a successful local brand, you want to be known. You want to be differentiated from your competitors. You want the consumer to have an association in their mind when they hear the product name. And some brands have done this very successfully. If I ask you, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you hear the word, say, Coca-Cola? What would you say?
Don't
think. First word.
Well, the first word or the first image? First image
and the first word or the first phrase.
When it comes to Coca-Cola, I just literally think of a bottle of Coke with the label. That's the first thing I think of when I think of Coca-Cola.
So that's the image. How about
the image? In terms of the word or phrase, popular. Okay. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of it.
So we would, for instance, this is a common thing that marketing practitioners do, try to understand the associations that consumers have with their brands. So they will give you a brand name and they will ask you the first word that comes to your mind. And of course, you would just, tell the first word that comes to your mind in the first second and describe the image. But some brands have done this very successfully through their advertising campaigns, through their consistent image of the products that carry maybe similar elements throughout product lines. So Coca-Cola is a wonderful example for this. I mean, in terms of doing a very good job in communicating the same image and the same words to the consumer. I will sometimes do some fun exercises of this sort. That, for instance, if I were to ask, 50 students, you will usually get, okay, what's the first word that comes to your mind? You will get fresh, cold, happiness as a word that comes to mind. So these are things that people will remember from the ads that they have seen or from the slogans, brand logos and slogans that they might have read over the years. And they will oftentimes remember a red image or the Coca-Cola bottle, this very iconic bottle. And they will think of sometimes Christmas as an image, Santa and so on, that these, again, have been communicated over the years by the brand. But the brand has managed to create a sort of a unified theme around the product itself, around the brand, that if you go to maybe other parts of the world, you might have similar associations. So that doesn't communicate too much, perhaps, about the brand values. And we can, of course, discuss all the negatives with Coca-Cola too. But ultimately, what they've managed to do is to create a product that many can differentiate and clearly have an image that is driven by their marketing efforts in their mind. other brands will try to mimic this, and sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. You might be able to ask people what comes to mind first when they think about Apple, or what's maybe the slogan that comes to mind when they hear the word Nike, and many will be able to recognize that. So ultimately, whether you are operating globally or you're trying to be a preferred brand in your local market, you want to be able to communicate consumers some values about your product so that they can remember, they can clearly recognize the brand when they go into a store. And maybe that will help them to choose your product. Who knows? At the same time, you want those consumers to be able to differentiate your product from some competitors' products. So those will be efforts that are perhaps the common denominators across the world.
Mm. Yeah, this is very, very, very interesting. Okay, so let's move to, digital media and social media and all these things. And I know you write about this and talk about it, and I'm sure you teach on this as well. So, oh man, so many issues here.
And we had a long list of discussion items potentially. I guess we won't be able to.
Yes. Well, we've been looking at some of them, but it's very interesting how there's one big kind of thing, and it just has its kind of life of its own of sorts. I guess let me ask this. So, I'll give you as much runway as you want with this. I guess my question that I have is twofold when it comes to, they're kind of related. You could tease them out separately, but in some ways, when we look at many, I think of, you can tell me how you conceptualize it or think about it, but when I think of social media platforms in particular, I usually think about, you could probably do this with dating apps as well. You could do this with probably a lot of things, but I always think about what's the original intention behind the creation of a product, right? So if you take something like Facebook, right? If the intention was, Zuckerberg wanted, to stay connected with his friends at different colleges. And then more broadly, the idea for Facebook was to stay connected with people around the world. I don't even know if Facebook still does that, but they've moved on to data collection at this point, right? So it's, they've moved on to different things. And I sometimes I think companies can do that if they adjust or shift, but I sometimes wonder, as something gets bigger and too far away from its original intention or original goal, it starts to kind of atrophy a little bit. And I wonder if that's where we see some of these problems. The second to this is, when I think about social media, we have something that's created. We have no idea if it's gonna work, if people will like it, if they won't, or how big it will be, right? So when Facebook came onto, online, nobody knew it was going to connect billions of people and be this whole big thing, and it owns everything now, Instagram and WhatsApp and all these things. Same thing with Twitter, same thing with TikTok, same thing with all these things. And when you think about these companies, or these platforms rather, they're so like in their infancy still. Like, are we going to have this? Like, what's Facebook going to look like 20 years from now? What does TikTok look like 30 years from now if it's still around? And I think when we think of other things we've done or created or other things, we never get it all right or figure it all out, or what are the rules or what are the parameters around something when it's still first being created or developed. We've figured that out through trial and error. And so you hear, especially on Twitter, that people talk a lot about content moderation. I think it's talked a lot about on Twitter. I think it does a little bit, I guess, on Instagram and maybe other places, but I hear a lot of it on Twitter. And I guess my question here, and this is a little bit more specific now, so again, as much as you want to share about this or feel comfortable sharing, but many people will say this idea that, Twitter is the kind of digital public square, right? And, this is where it's, free speech and exchange of ideas, and people can say what they want and all these things like that. And if you say, no, you can't, because there's some moderation, because you've, broken, terms of agreement or whatever, they're being censored. And, people get very up in arms about this, right? And they start bringing in, in the United States, First Amendment stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess my question here is in terms of the content moderation. Twitter is just an example, so we can stick with that. And again, I know it's got a new overlord now, so Elon's doing whatever he's doing there. But do you see a place like Twitter, or maybe social media in general, but as like a digital public square? And what are the kinds of ways in which we should discuss and talk about content moderation for things like social media platforms?
So that was, again, a lot there. But
yeah, I know it's a lot there. I know it's a lot.
Like the early days or how a company might look different in the early days versus later on. Of course, companies always evolve, but let's go into the social media and content moderation, which is actually much closer to my research. So I do absolutely see Twitter as a public square, and that's how the previous CEO of the platform, the founder, Jack Dorsey, had also seen. That's how he was describing the platform, and that very much explains some of the underdeveloped features of this platform too. Because when you spoke to people at fairly high ranks of this company before Elon Musk took over, they had very much embodied this idea that what we are operating here, we were not necessarily running a company that is out there to maximize profits and do everything that will generate revenue. We are here also as a public square. We create communication between people, and it's real time. It's very large exchanges of communication among very large bodies of various different populations around the world. So our job is above and beyond generating revenue. It's something else. They had all embodied this idea. And in many ways, I think if you look at Twitter, you will see that many features were very underdeveloped over time. Just something as simple as an edit button, right? I mean, you would think that should be one of the very first features to integrate into a platform which is relying on content generation by users. And they haven't, and there are clear reasons for that. So when you think about the influence of Twitter, this is not just about users communicating, like unlike Facebook, where you communicate with your friends, family, people from offline conversations, oftentimes just moving things into online space, at least when it started out. Twitter is a communication space for many different individuals who might have never met in real life. And communication between ordinary users and politicians, citizens, or users of a brand, and managers and public personalities and so on. So it facilitates communication in so many other ways, that communication that would be very hard to achieve otherwise. It's not just one way. Oftentimes it's two-way communication. Public figures, politicians might be hearing the things that people are saying, and they might be responding back to them as well. So in many ways, it's a platform that facilitates a type of communication or fills the gap for a type of communication that we haven't been able to perhaps create in the world before Twitter and likes of Twitter came into the online space. And I stopped you there previously. I interrupted you, so let me.
No, it's okay. No, it's fine. I'm really curious. So you think it is a public square, the digital public square? I mean, I don't see it that way. I mean, how do you see it? Look, if it's a private company that has terms of service, and if they say these are the things you can do and cannot do as a private company, if they say, look, we're gonna block you, we're gonna suspend your account for X amount of hours or days, we're gonna kick you off of here, that's definitely within their right to do that, right? Like yes. It doesn't. So how does it function then as a public square? I mean, we can have the separate conversation that kind of what my first point was companies don't imagine they're going to be global with billions of users and billions of dollars and all these things. I don't know if Twitter thought it was going to be that huge or whatever. And I think there's a space to talk about companies that are technically private, but have so much influence that they might need a new set of rules or regulations. That's a different conversation. But as it currently stands, there's an owner or owners of a private company, and they decide what gets moderated and what doesn't. And if you don't like it, I mean, tough shit, right? Like, people can't cry about censorship because they signed up with those terms of service and agreement, right? So that's how I see it. But you tell me, where am I wrong here? Help me understand this.
You're not wrong. This is not a black and white issue. This is very much a shades of a gray issue. And let me put a few things out there as information that might be helpful in trying to think about these questions. So the first thing is, does content moderation count as censorship? And perhaps I think we can think of content moderation as a way of creating governance rules that help to identify who can produce information, who can disseminate information, and what information eventually reaches out to the rest of the public and which information doesn't. And that could be, of course, different players, different agents in different markets, different countries who would set very different rules for content moderation as we might define it for different objectives. You might think of a dictator in one country who will simply put rules around what platforms you might have access to or what topics you might be allowed to discuss, simply to be able to maintain political power or keep their political power in place. That's slightly different, perhaps, objective than some of the other objectives. So for instance, EU, in Germany, and in some of the other countries around the world, policymakers, regulators also have rules around what kind of content can be posted on online platforms. For instance, Germany has rules against hate content, content that might be targeting a particular group, acting or inciting violence. Is against the law, and if there's such content, platforms have regulations to be mandates to act against these content. At the same time, of course, profit maximizing platforms like Twitter have different incentives. They might want to take out some content because it might potentially harm some subsets of the other consumer groups, or it might reduce the engagement of those other consumers. So it's almost a balancing act for profit maximizing companies. You have to be able to know if somebody is talking about politics, and if I have an algorithm that allows everyone to hear about these very maybe extreme political opinions, how is that influencing the ability of the other users to feel comfortable on this platform and to express their opinions? So I think when we think about this idea of content moderation, we always focus on the removal part, or some accounts are closed and maybe some content is taken down and so on. But when you keep that content, the assumption that you're making, maybe when you keep that content, everybody else will be able to speak their minds. That's essentially a wrong assumption. When you keep certain types of content, that's going to suppress some of the parts of the population, and those individuals won't be able to express their opinions as well. So it's a balancing act for profit maximizing platforms. Okay, what content do I remove to be able to maybe keep other users engaged? So so if you don't remove any content, you're also not going to be able to hear from everyone. That's unfortunately the true reality. But putting that aside, there's also this question of how often do we even see content moderation? And in profit maximizing platforms case, we of course have a variety of different rules. Some platforms just take pride in not removing any content, not having any community rules whatsoever. And that's how they try to lure the users on that platform. That's how they pitch their differentiation strategy. And people who do not want to see any content removed or any action taken would choose to go into those platforms. There are other platforms who actually very openly market and communicate the information that they won't allow any hate content. They won't allow any content that would target certain populations. And that's how they try to pitch the community and the discussion environment that they have. And that's how they try to maybe attract users. And there are platforms in between, like Twitter, which have some rules and implement these rules. But the reality of it is that we tend to, and this is coming from empirical research that's done by some University of Chicago researcher, we tend to overestimate the degree of content moderation, or how likely platforms are to take action against offensive content. People grossly overestimate. They think that this is a very high number, but when in reality, when you look at it, first, the amount of hate content or amount of offensive content compared to all content that's out there on Twitter, it's very small. I recall a number like 1% or so. But on top of that, when you look at if you are reporting those content, for instance, to Twitter, and then expecting potentially Twitter to take it off the platform, the likelihood of Twitter taking an action is also very, very low. It's less than 10%. So first of all, we're looking at a fairly small piece of information on the internet in terms of the offensive content and the actions that are taken. It's not like Twitter is removing 100% of everything that's flagged. That they've been removing very small pieces of it. So, but when you ask consumers, when you ask users, what do you think? How often do you think accounts are closed? How often do you think platforms are censoring? They estimate these numbers to be much, much higher. So that's actually a misbelief. So platforms are not that active. A second piece of this is public figures, politicians are oftentimes they even though I think we have a few examples in mind that are very publicly known, that's just or availability bias. We're able to recall these things because they're always in the news media. We see them, we hear about them, our friends talk about them, these examples, and they are somewhat controversial examples, perhaps, of account closures. But the reality of it is that politicians actually enjoy extra freedoms in terms of their speech when you look into content moderation or community rules of platforms compared to ordinary citizens. The idea is that even though they might be, for instance, putting out misinformation or fairly unacceptable content, they are public figures and they're politicians, and what they say is going to be of interest to broader public and for policy reasons and other. So these individuals actually enjoy much more lenient community rules compared to other individuals. So there's also that piece. And these are all built into the community rules of platforms like Twitter and others. So even though we have these couple examples in mind, this is not a very wide phenomenon. It's not a very common phenomenon. It's definitely not something that politicians are punished more for compared to ordinary citizens. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and in your last point, I certainly agree with you. I think a lot of people that this does happen, or people that see this with maybe their people that friends or colleagues, it's basically happening all the time, and people are being blocked and suspended, and they're foaming at the mouth about this stuff, and I do agree. I think in the broad, has it happened unfairly or unjustly? Maybe sometimes. Sure, you can make an argument for that, but in the grand scheme of things, yes, it's very, very, very minimal. That said, I guess the argument here becomes, and this might be a little bit too broad, but you tell me what you think. Is there, in terms of content moderation, or should there be, and is there, or are there at the moment, a difference between public enterprises or public spaces, at least in the United States, obviously this is different in other countries, versus private companies or private spaces doing it? Now, this might not be a good analogy, but I'll go with it.
Can I ask you to clarify public and private? Publicly owned versus privately owned, as in the organization, or public versus private institutions? So what I mean by that is a regulator might make very different decisions regarding content moderation. That's the public institution versus the private. Twitter, even if it's privately, or let's say Facebook, even if it's a publicly traded company, it's still a private organization.
Yes, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Yes, how you just described it. So, for example, if I go to a public park, right, that's governed by or managed by Department of Parks and Service or whatever it is in a particular city or a particular county and or state, right? If I go to a state park, there are certain rules about what you can't be there after dark or whatever, right? Don't, expose yourself. Like there's like basic general rules. Everything else kind of goes, right? And it's broad because it's used for the public for different folks. Now, again, the analogy might not work here, but if somebody comes to my house and they're on my yard or on my lawn, that's a private home. That's a private place. Or I guess you could use like a, what's it called? Not a clubhouse, a private place that where people can hang out. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but
I see. So sub communities. You're thinking of sub communities that might have stricter rules.
Yeah, where there's someone owns it and it's private property, and they're allowing people to come on there, but there's stricter rules, right? So obviously, it's going to be restrictive. Now, again, this might not be an exact one-to-one, but that's my question here is even and there's a bigger problem here because of how massive and global, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are. But in theory, Twitter can choose to make whichever rules they want, and they enforce them, and that's it. Like if someone doesn't like it, they don't have to do anything about it because they agreed to it in the beginning. That's a different. Don't you think that there is a different standard or boundaries for something that is public versus something that's private? I know people will make the argument that Twitter's private technically, but it basically acts like a public place and or publicly governed because of its reach and because of its influence and all these things. And people get very upset about how inconsistent it is with enforcing some rules for some people as opposed to others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess my main question here is that difference between should there be, and do you think there are differences between public versus private institutions and or organizations?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what you are thinking or what you might have in mind is actually publicly traded versus privately owned companies. Publicly traded companies would, of course, have their shareholders that they have to report to on a regular basis, and those shareholders may not be happy with some of the policies that you have. And that might act as a disciplining force on some of the decisions that you can make. At the same time, a privately owned company like Twitter right now, it's of course going to be very subject to the personal preferences of the owner. And that's usually true for other media outlets too. Then you look into sometimes the political biases of the various newspapers that we have had historically. You will see that the reportings of the newspaper was very much influenced by the owner of that newspaper. And then the owner will hire editors and journalists that are in line with his or her views, and the reporting will be, of course, very biased too. So this is not a unique issue to social media, but in general, when you have an owner who has their own agenda, whatever that might be, political or otherwise, they might shape the actions of the company. Now, is that something desirable from the perspective of keeping the company going and healthy and keeping the consumers around and wanting to consume that product? I would argue that it's not always the case. And let's go with the example of Twitter. Upon the manifestations of some of the personal preferences of Elon Musk, whether that might be completely relaxing content moderation or changing some of the features of the platform, we have seen backlash. We have seen masses of consumers moving to alternate platforms, like Mastodon became going from less than 100,000 users to over a couple million users in a matter of weeks, which is a very fast growth of user base that it would have never achieved in the absence of some of these manifestations of action. Is that good for Twitter? And ultimately, is that good for Elon Musk? I think those are questions that one can ask and one can say, probably not, because if you are a platform, you want to keep the users on. That's what makes a success of a platform or any product in the marketplace. And the second thing that happened along those lines, of course, many of the social media platforms, their source of revenue is advertising, and you want to be able to keep advertisers on board. Now, if users are leaving the platform, advertisers will not be willing to pay the big bucks to advertise on your platform, and you won't be able to sustain the organization or the platform. And on top of that, of course, many advertisers also had very deliberate responses to the content moderation policies. Now, this is something that big advertisers also have done before Twitter. In a year and a half ago, on Facebook, for instance, there was a boycott of about 500 advertisers who believed that Facebook wasn't doing enough to combat misinformation. And they pulled out their ads from the platform for a period of time, and that was a significant loss for Facebook. So advertisers do not always want to be on a platform where the platform is simply a magnet for everyone who wants to speak their mind and a place full of misinformation. It's not necessarily an attractive place to put your product information out there. And that may not always be the crowd that you want to speak to. So if you don't have advertisers, you don't have a business either. So yes, there is in theory a difference between publicly owned, publicly traded, and privately owned companies. But ultimately, if the goal is to maintain the success of a platform, to keep your users on, engaged, happy, communicating, and keep your revenue sources and the providers of the revenue sources on, I think ultimately the objectives of publicly traded and privately owned companies will converge. And that would mean the strategies of these platforms should also converge. Is there an influence of the private owners on private companies, not just for social media, for a lot of different companies? It's an absolute yes. Is that necessarily in the best interest of the company? Not always.
Interesting. It's I see where you're coming from on this, and I do agree with you in the shades of gray. Okay, so the last question I want to ask you is you can just you can go as long as you want on this, or you can be brief on this, whatever you feel comfortable with. But it's about TikTok. I talked about this not that long ago with Ann Kokis. She wrote a book called I think it's Digital Sovereignty. I think that's the name of the book. Or no, it's called Trafficking Data is what it's called. And so I guess I want to, again, from your perspective here, TikTok is particular. I mean, this is true for all or for many social media platforms and other platforms, but for TikTok, it seems there's been obviously many things about it in the news, and there was almost a ban here, and then there's been a lot of concerns about TikTok. So we can talk about that specifically in terms of as an example, but more generally, this idea on a type of digital sovereignty, right? Like who owns my data, right? When I post a picture, when I post words or ideas, or when I post anything, to a platform, in the case of TikTok, it has access to all of your information and things like that. That doesn't necessarily yours anymore, right? And this is happening for a lot of platforms, I think. And how do we understand that, and how do we deal with that? And in terms of a marketing perspective, how are people marketing folks able to talk about that or combat that, or how do we work within the landscape in which things are operating with TikTok and other platforms in terms of data protection and trafficking data and all that?
Yeah, this is a very important issue, and an issue that we'll continue to hear more and more about. So just to put, I think, for the audience, digital sovereignty in terms of the definition, it's basically this idea that you as the consumer would have the control over your digital experience. And that might involve the data, it might involve software and hardware, and any engagement that you might have with the platforms. And this is a growing concern for especially policymakers in the EU. Over the past number of years, we've seen many regulations come out that will help with the privacy of the consumers. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that was enforced in 2018, was one big piece of it, which prevented firms from collecting consumer data without their express consent, and have to put in a number of different mandates. For example, you have to encrypt data, you have to store data in safe spaces, and you have to also give additional freedoms to consumers. So we have seen over the years, for instance, introductions of the ability to download data. And now with the new Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act in the EU, we are also going to see additional freedoms given to consumers about what they can do with their data. For instance, the ability to take your data and go from one platform to another, right? This has been always an issue. You might stick with Facebook because, you have a history in Facebook. You have all your images, your contacts, your friends. And even if you wanted to move to an alternate platform, let's say tomorrow there was a viable alternate, and you wanted to move, it's so much work to be able to create that history. That's especially true for email accounts, right? Which is moving all of that information. So now the idea is that data portability, you would be able to download things and take them from one platform to another easily. So this is supposed to be one of the new features that consumers should be able to do, again, under the Digital Markets and Digital Services Act. So there's a lot that I think we have done over the past decade, especially in terms of giving consumers more control over their data. But you're absolutely right that this is possibly not enough, because your data ultimately are under the control of platforms, and they use the data to be able to serve ads to you, to provide products to you. And this, of course, to some extent benefits the consumers. The question is what happens when the platforms don't have the ability to use that data? How does that affect the consumer experience? And the follow-up question is, what can be some of the remedies? If we think that platforms having too much control over the data is an issue, what are some of the solutions that we can offer? So on this, let me go over some of the potential, the two sides of the maybe coin that we would have to think about, some of the potential issues that we would have to put on the table before we make decisions regarding data privacy.
Okay.
Also, just as a side note, of course, EU is, I think, typically EU tends to move faster, further. They tend to be a little more advanced in consumer protection, but in the United States, too, we've seen, of course, the California Privacy Act, and we've seen many other states also introduce various regulations around consumer privacy. Yeah. So we will continue to see, I think, more regulations towards protecting consumer data and giving more freedom to consumers about what platforms can do with their data. So go back to this idea of consumer privacy. Now, this is an issue in some ways that puzzles a lot of researchers, because this is oftentimes referred to as the privacy paradox. When you ask consumers about how much they care about their privacy and the measures that they would be willing to go to protect it, you will oftentimes get answers like, yes, I care a lot about my privacy, and I'm very upset that platforms are not doing enough to protect my privacy. At the same time, when you look at their behaviors, the revealed preferences, when you look into, for instance, how often they delete their caches, their histories, how often they maybe put an ad blocker or other features that might prevent tracking, you will see that many consumers don't do that oftentimes, or they will agree to sharing data. They'll accept cookies and other things. So unfortunately, even if the consumer is educated and they know that firms can collect data about them, they don't always act in ways that try to protect their own privacy. So there might be many reasons for that, right? Maybe consumers are not giving the right choices to be able to protect their privacy. Maybe there are some frictions that prevent them from being able to manifest the behaviors that really reveal how much they care about their privacy and their attitudes toward privacy. But presumably, there are also other factors that might come into the picture. One idea is this idea of differential privacy. The consumer that you might have in mind might have very different preferences towards sharing their data with different platforms. Maybe I care about Spotify, for instance, storing data about me, or Pandora, another platform, let's give it that way, storing data about my listening preferences, because they can make really good recommendations for me for new brands and new artists to discover.
Right.
Or maybe I want to share my data, my history of watching shows and movies with Netflix, because again, they can then customize ratings for me and they can make good recommendations. And maybe I do not like sharing my data with a car insurance company or a health insurance company, because I worry that they might price discriminate against me. They might maybe not offer the best prices for me or the best options for me. So consumers do not always have the same preferences in terms of sharing their data. They might want to share their data with one company and share very intimate things if they believe they are getting something out of it. And they may absolutely hate the idea of sharing data with another company. So we need to understand that it's very hard to put a blanket policy around data sharing. Even for a single consumer, their preferences about sharing their data vary a lot across different products and different services and different brands. At the same time, let's think about the other side of the coin. From the firm's perspective, what happens when consumers do not share data? And we have seen this very much. You might be following maybe some of the developments that are happening in the privacy landscape, aside from GDPR, which was a big regulation, and changing the landscape very much in EU. Mm-hmm. On top of that, of course, there were more recent privacy moves by private companies, like Apple's elimination of the third-party cookie. That reduced the ability of third-party companies from collecting and reduced the ability of collecting consumer data from another platform. So what would that mean? For instance, when users are on an Apple browser, it's going to be very difficult for Facebook to be able to obtain data about consumers, that particular consumer who's using Facebook and many other websites. It's going to make it very difficult for Facebook to be able to collect data about that particular consumer and learn that maybe that consumer is really interested in fishing or in certain apparel brands or maybe certain sports and so on. So if Facebook doesn't have that information, that means that for the advertising efforts of Facebook is going to be not great. They're not going to be able to target the right products for the right consumers. So as a consumer on Facebook, you might be, someone who's interested in fishing and maybe someone who hates, let's make it up, someone who hates curling as a sport, and you might be receiving ads related to curling. So, and never about fishing. So you might receive ads from brands and products that you have no interest in. In some ways, that's a waste of advertisers' money. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's also not an excellent, wonderful experience for the consumer. In many ways, this world of less tracking, less information gathering about consumers, and then trying to target them as an advertiser, as a brand, that's with all the digital protections, while it's of course great for the consumer, it throws the experience, the advertising and marketing experience back many decades ago. We don't know enough about the consumer, therefore we might be sending them a lot of irrelevant information. Think of the days when you might be receiving all these mailing catalogs at home, and I would sometimes receive these completely irrelevant catalogs from completely irrelevant brands that I've never had any interest in my life, and I would immediately throw that catalog in the trash. Mm-hmm. I would never even spend a minute of my time. That's a big waste on the firm and in their marketing budget and so on. And that's in some ways an annoying experience for me, because I'm receiving all these piles of mail in catalogs, papers, and so on that I don't want to even have, I don't want to see. Now, the same experience might be happening in a digital world where, because I don't know who to target, and because my targeting efficiency is fairly low, the consumer is going to start hearing from brands that they do not want to hear from, or they have no interest in. And the advertisers will spend some money on consumers that they probably should not be spending money on. So in some ways, the other side of the flip side of the coin is that in a higher privacy world, we have to also think about how can we make sure that we are not wasting money on ads that no one wants to put out and no one wants to see, because ultimately that's a waste. And how can we protect consumers from seeing things that they have no interest in, and maybe helping them to discover brands and products that they would really love to know, the things that they might personally find interesting, that might help improve their lives and maybe help the small brands, small businesses to grow as well. So privacy is a complicated question from that perspective. But thinking about all these controls that we have, there's going to be a flip side of this, which is about, in return for all the controls, how is the experience of the consumer online and the relationship and the interactions with brands changing? How is the experience and sort of marketing efficiency of the firms changing? Does that ultimately create a waste and an increase in the abundance of irrelevant ads and brands that consumers are seeing? Because that's in many ways an obtrusive experience. Does that happen? We have to ask all these questions. And ultimately, we also have to think about how else can we do this, right? Or what are the other ways that we can support consumers and support firms? Because an alternate to this, right? Oftentimes the data collection are carried out with a number of different efforts. It might be because I need to learn about your usage, what you like to listen to, so I can make you suggestions and recommendations about what else to consume. And a second reason is that I want to serve you advertising that might relate to your preferences, your lifestyle. Sometimes brands will also collect data to be able to trade that data, sell that data, but that's a much more limited experience or practice. So oftentimes those are the reasons why there's going to be advertising. And if you don't want that, especially if you don't want the second piece, you don't want to have ads, firms, just like Spotify again, will offer you options, these premium options, that will help you to upgrade to a paid version. So then the consumer also has to make this trade-off. Do I want to share my data and receive a product for free, or do I want to protect my privacy and pay for that, and maybe pay for the lesser, the lower quality experience of being constantly interrupted by ads? And we might start seeing more and more examples of this in the way that brands interact with consumers. So that's the second part of the question. As maybe advertising becomes less profitable from the perspective of platforms, because if advertising is not efficient, if it's not helping consumers discover products that they're interested in, and if it's interrupting their experience and resulting in a worse experience, then of course advertisers are not going to want to pay that money for platforms. And if advertising is not becoming a viable revenue source, then you will have to switch into paid forms. And then we need to think about whether consumers will have the ability to pay and be able to enjoy some of the free services that they're offering to the same extent. So it's an experiment in many ways. And there are also other firms that are experimenting with paying consumers to be able to obtain their data. Right? I will pay you some money in exchange for you telling me what your preferences are, who you are, and so on. And people can decide oftentimes what the right price for them might be. So we will also see probably experiences and practices like this, where your data might be used by the firm in exchange for some, not just the free product, the free service that you're getting, but on top of that, some payment, some pay. And we'll be moving towards that world, which is not always a cheaper world. So a lot to digest in that sense. But I think we are in the midst of a dramatic shift in terms of digital sovereignty, and we are going to see a lot more regulations in this space too.
Yeah, you say it very, very nicely, and the way you explain it is very, looking at the kind of acuity of the problem and kind of where we're headed, which was my last question, which is, we've talked about so many things today. We've talked about content moderation. We've talked about privacy. We've talked about loyalty and aspects of various pieces of marketing, what we consume. And the thing that kind of sticks out to me with all of this is, I guess, two things, right? You said it at the beginning. At the end of the day, we're talking about how the human or the person is at the center of this, or should be, or whatever, whether you're seeing a person as a consumer or whatever. And so we have to keep that idea of the humanity, not just numbers or statistics or things like that. So I guess as we move into the future, and you were kind of touching on this at the end there, how do we, we have a lot of things that we've been doing, and in many ways these things are still young, but how do we, as we move further into the 21st century and we're, kind of getting over these growing pains, how do we keep the human at the center of things? And how do we continue to evolve and develop a type of ethic or ethics for marketing in various domains and in various platforms, et cetera?
That's a very big question. It's of course, it will depend very much on the type of platform and the type of product.
Sure.
But ultimately, I believe that we have to trust in the consumer. The consumers are telling us what they want. And if we are willing to listen, then we will be able to provide them the products and the services and the experiences that they want. And that is ultimately in the best interest of any company who wants to remain in business for a long term. We have to listen to the consumer and make sure that we are paying attention to their outcomes, their betterment, their health, their mental, their physical and mental happiness, and their satisfaction. So I think many firms are very much aware of this, at least the ones that seem to be doing better in the marketplace. They understand that their business decisions are influencing consumers on a number of different dimensions. It's a financial decision. It's sometimes a physical experience. It might be experiencing their mental health and happiness and everything else. And ultimately, if you understand all of those effects on your consumer, and if you're aware and if you care about all those outcomes, then you have to make the decisions that will help the consumer to be satisfied and to be well for a long term. So I think brands are becoming more aware of this, and they are making decisions that are in line with that perspective. But at the same time, of course, policymakers have a big role in all of this as well. We have so much more data now, right? Compared to maybe a couple, 1 or 2 decades ago. Marketers have always collected data. This is not a new practice. They've been collecting data, for half a century, more than that. But the amount of data that we have about all these outcomes, the engagement of consumers, happiness of consumers, financial health of consumers, everything else, we have so much that we can learn and we can assess. And policymakers have the freedom of being able to access such data at greater lengths than maybe an individual company. So we have to work, I think, hand in hand with the policymakers as well to make sure that decisions that we are making, which we think are good for the consumers, do not cause any harm on the consumer in the long term, or do not cause any harm on a subgroup of consumers, even though it might be good for the rest of the consumers. So we have so much more data to be able to understand and answer all these questions that we have right now. And what we need to do is to take advantage of it and learn more about the preferences and the needs and the outcomes.
Yeah.
Altogether.
Well, Pinar, it's been very nice talking with you for a couple of hours. You've been super generous with your time and all of your wisdom. So I greatly appreciate that. Where is the best place for people to find you and find your work and your research and anywhere online?
I do have a website, pinaryildirim.com, or they can find me on my Wharton website, and I'd be happy to hear from them. I'm also on the major social media websites. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Happy to hear from them. And thanks so much for having me. I had fun talking about marketing with you.
Yeah. So I was going to say it was really a delight to listen to you. Obviously, you're very, very knowledgeable and sharp on all of this stuff, and able to communicate it in a way that's, at least for someone that's not in this world, able to follow. And I'm very certain that listeners will enjoy it as well. So I can't say enough thank you for coming on and giving your time and your energy. So big thanks.